everyone, and welcome to the Creative Mind podcast. My name is Ashley Hagman. I'm adjunct professor and therapist, and this podcast is about understanding psychology from a Christian perspective and also discussing psychology's influence on culture. It's exactly what we're going to be doing today. There has been an article that has come across my newsfeed a lot over the past couple weeks about a young woman who has no physical illnesses and yet is scheduled to be euthanized next month. And I wanted to process this from a Christian perspective. And so I have a guest today who is a hospice chaplain, who I think can give us some insight on death and kind of the value and meaning of life and suffering. But first, before we get to that, I wanted to give a little bit of background on the state of the legality of euthanasia for mental illness and how often it happens, and talk a little bit about that. So right now, it's legal in very few countries. In the Netherlands, it's been legal since the 90s. And really, there's only been a few cases of it occurring up until 2010s, when the rates have, in comparison, exploded. So the last date that there was data available was 2011, which is many years ago now. And they had about 100 deaths at that time, up from just a few cases a year. And it's becoming increasingly more legal in other countries. Most notably, recently became legal in Canada. At first, it was, put on hold, but I just saw an article as of March that a judge in Calgary actually approved for an unnamed woman to be euthanized at a later date. Yeah, so it's a little bit of background. So it's not very legal at this point. There's not, thankfully, a lot of support for it in the medical community. However, just in my own experience, seeing mental health professionals talk about this, there is a push towards this being an accepted thing within counseling and therapy in general. So I think it's something that we definitely need to address. Yeah. Oh, and then I wanted to share about just the people that are kind of the face of this. So the woman who was in the article that came across my newsfeed was Zoraia Tabik. She's only 28 years old. She is in the Netherlands, so it's legal there and likely will happen to her. But I also read an article about Aurelia Brouwers, who actually did pass euthanasia, and I wanted to highlight, she really is suffering. It really is difficult for her, and that's part of what we want to discuss today, is how to respond to suffering in the right way. So she passed in January of 2018. There's an article on the BBC about her, and she just talked about how every breath is torture, and she was diagnosed with depression at the age of 12 and has battled self-harm for her entire life. And she just feels that she's never known what happiness is. Here's a quote from her. "I'm stuck in my own body, my own head, and I just want to be free," she said. "I have never been happy. I don't know the concept of happiness." So hopefully that kind of frames the discussion. It's the state of where things are today. And now I'd like to introduce my guest, Krag Runzi. He is a chaplain. So Krag, why don't you give us a little background on your work? How long have you been doing this work? And about yourself.
Yeah, my name's Krag Runzi. I've been a chaplain for a local hospice agency in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, going on 2 years. I'm also a chaplain candidate in the United States Army, and then I've been in ministry as a pastor for close to a decade. Married to my wife Holly, celebrating 21 years this year in August.
Yes.
And just extremely blessed, and feel like we also know a little bit about suffering as well as just the glorious feeling of knowing God will lead you through hard times. And so that's those trials and difficulties have a purpose, and hopefully we can highlight that today, Ashley.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I think that when it comes to these discussions, pro-life discussions, both beginning and end of life, the main criticism of pro-life people is you have no compassion. You don't understand. You don't understand what it's like. I worked at a pregnancy resource center, and that was kind of like the accusation, where it was, you don't get it. You don't get what it's like. And it's like, no, I meet with people. I see their lives. I know how hard it is when you have 3 kids under 3 already, and you find out you're pregnant, and it's a hard thing in life. But yeah, so I want to spend some time kind of dispelling that myth and discuss, just spend some time in compassion for understanding what it's like to suffer. So can you kind of paint a picture of what it's like to sit with people that you sit with as they're dying, and what they experience or their loved ones experience? And yeah, paint a picture for us with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say that in chaplaincy, when you step into a room, there is a very quick realization and recognizing of the family is either a firm biblically based Christian family versus a secular individual or secular family, and how the suffering and difficulty of failing health is handled. It the feeling is genuinely palpable in the room,
Mm.
that you can tell. There are some that believe this is going to come to an end with hope, versus a nihilistic, we don't know, and what does it matter? And so the trajectory for comfort care, not to say that individuals that are not believers can't experience comfort, but that we have a tremendously large amount of resources as Christians to pull from and to
Absolutely.
point to for hope in Christ. And that one of my favorite things to tell a believing patient is that they are quickly approaching what I would call graduation day. That
Mm.
the time of sanctification is about to come to an end, and they are about to experience glorification, and have been able to build some beautiful relationships of, for elderly, bonus grandmas and grandpas. That has been wonderful, and to know that one day we will be shoulder to shoulder in glory, praising God. So that is a tremendous blessing to me, that it is not in hospice as a chaplain a
Mm-hmm.
depressing or hard thing, that we do believe that the suffering comes to an end. I think it's important for us as Christians to not be afraid to point to where is the source of suffering from, and that it is not a twisted, angry, mean God that has
Mm.
allowed this to happen. But as you and I know, Ashley, Genesis 3 from the fall, we made this mess, that we have created and introduced suffering and death through our rebellion. And that as we have that fundamental understanding, we're looking through the lens of the fall has happened by Adam as the federal head, and that we are guilty of it. And so suffering then can be seen as a testimony of the necessity for Christ to come and to accomplish
Mm.
redemption. And so we dwell in the already but not yet completely done, and that we can assure our patients that that graduation day, as it comes, they've got something to look forward to. For instance, Romans 8:18, Paul says, "For I consider that sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us." So as we suffer, we know that mankind has created this, but God is allowing it to be utilized as a testimony of the fall and the need for redemption. And that Paul calls it a little bit later on, the creation is groaning. And so
Mm.
when we're there in those rooms and we see a health declining, you see the groans, but we also know the hope that is to come, and that Jesus has in fact come to end suffering, and he endured that suffering the same as we do, and defeated it. That is our hope. And for the non-believer, I got nothing. I can be nice to
Yeah.
them. I can
Yeah.
hold their hand and pat them and pray out the gospel, but all of that hope for redemption from the fall, if they reject it, I don't have that.
Yeah, so as Christians kind of considering this topic and responding to this topic, we have to understand there's meaning in suffering, and it's not just an
Mm-hmm.
end in itself. And I think that that's where a lot of the push towards accepting euthanasia comes from, is kind of this understanding of, so we see suffering as temporary towards a goal. We see it as redeemed. We see that there's a purpose, and we see that God is good, and we have hope. And I think it's a case of like, you can endure almost anything if you know it's temporary and you have a hope that there's something better in the future. But I
Hmm.
think if you, like you said, if you don't have that hope, what is there? And so I think as Christians, if you hold to the Christian faith, you have to have a hope for everyone, that there is more beyond this world, and that our lives mean more than just what we're experiencing right now, and that this is a temporary experience. So for those who are pushing for euthanasia, do you have kind of any insight as to why they might view that as either an option for themselves or for other people? Like, what kind of language are they? Do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that value of human life, that they have a misskewed understanding of their value, that from the womb to the tomb, we have a precious value, in that it starts with that fundamental Christian understanding of the Imago Dei principle, that Genesis 1:27, right? Like, you are image bearers of God. He made you. And so with that we were in Genesis 2:7, dirt patted out, and then he breathes in his spirit, and that we look like him, and that we're made in his image, and that we have a tremendous value versus a secular atheistic understanding of that you're just a fluke, and that
Mm-hmm.
you come and you go. That's not much of a story, but I think that the Christian has to say that all people have that value. And that's why you're doing this podcast, right? Is to
Mm-hmm.
push back and to say,
Absolutely.
hey, I want to tell you what your actual tremendous value is, your worth, and that what we value and what we believe has value, we will protect and defend. So people are not disposable. And if you're not stepping into that consideration, then of course you would say, well, if there's somebody inferior, or you believe that there is no deep investment into something, it's disposable. But people aren't plastic water bottles. We
Mm-hmm.
are we're image bearers of God with a tremendous value. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. So it's not just what our lives are for, that there
Mm,
is an end hope, but it's also the beginning of our lives and the root of what it means to be a human, that we, like you said, are made in the image of God. And so we derive our meaning and our existence from Christ, and our lives are from God, and our lives are for him as well. So there is kind of that beginning of humanity, and the trajectory of what it's for. And yeah, if you don't have that, like you said, the atheistic standpoint of this is all maybe just an accident. And I think too, a really powerful concept in culture, but particularly in mental health, is that the idea is that our lives are for self-actualization, that the point of our
mm,
lives is to have this, and by self-actualization I mean this like nebulous feeling of fulfillment in your life, that is the highest ideal, that is when you've attained the highest level in your life. And so I think if you are experiencing a condition that denies you this feeling of fulfillment, if you have treatment resistant mental health issues to where the doctors are saying, oh, you'll never, which I think is extremely hopeless and inaccurate. But anyways, you're never able to recover from your depression or whatever. And so you can't attain to self-actualization. You can't become fully what it means to be human. Then why not give up? There's nothing left to live at that point, because you can't fulfill kind of the point or the goal of the human life. But the Christian has a different view. And so if you are a Christian and you subscribe to Christian ideals, like, you have to understand where we derive our meaning in existence, and then what it's for and what it's to. Absolutely. I
yeah. Yeah,
completely agree.
absolutely. And that realization, we can say that from the secular standpoint, that attaining some sort of self-realized happiness is where it's at, and after that it's not worth living anymore. And the stark contrast to the Godhead's understanding is Jesus has come, and his arrival is with purpose to serve, rescue, and redeem. And so 1 Corinthians 15:21-23 cites this tremendously that service, and as a chaplain or as a pastor, I will tell you that when people are low and we encourage them to go and serve others, a lot of times they're a little bit happier afterwards. They feel a
Mm-hmm.
little bit more purpose. And that, so that toil part that we're made for is that an understanding providentially that we're made to be servants, not to be served. And so that the world doesn't necessarily accomplish its will for my benefit, but that I'm a contributor to the glory of God, and to just encourage the non-believer to just maybe think about it, maybe
Yeah.
consider that the entire universe does not form and run around you. It's not in orbit around you. And that changes a lot of very tangible things in one's life. And that the value part comes about for the individual is you are a contributor. Others affirm and see of great value that we as Christians believe we're the hands and feet of Jesus, right? That we make up the church, and that as we're encouraging and interacting with people, that there is a big story with big value for people, even if there's somebody that the secular world would say is unwanted, not to step into another area of topic, but there is a
Mm-hmm.
genocide right now in our country of those with Down syndrome at the womb as they're terminated. And I have been
Yeah.
so blessed to have Down syndrome individuals in my life who are some of the most fantastic, insightful, and incredible blessings in my life. So it's just
Amen.
yet another area to say, who are you, world, to say somebody doesn't have value?
And the even the secular research in psychology supports this idea that the more we it's happiness is kind of this thing that the more you seek in it for its own sake, the
Mm-hmm.
less you're able to grab hold of it. It's like trying to hold water in your hands. And then they found that studies on altruism and people who are other focused, that they tend to be happier. And so it's like it's this way of observing, God's general revelation in nature, and the way that we were created is
Mm-hmm.
that we were not created towards ourselves. We were not created to be oriented towards our own happiness necessarily. Not that we don't seek our happiness. That's a beautiful thing to look for, but that's not the point of our lives. And there's more to what we are made for than just our own happiness. That and and by serving others and by being other focused, we actually achieve the very thing that we are not focusing on, I guess. If that
That's
makes
right.
sense.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
So
it.
it's beautiful to see how God's truth is revealed even in the body of secular psychological research, which I should look up some of those studies and post them in the show notes, because they're really there. But at the same time, we do want to show, we do have, when you meet with somebody who is going through this intense suffering, it's hard, right? It's hard to
Mm-hmm.
be there. I know for me, it was really a turning point when I was sitting in the room with my grandmother when she was passing, and just the intense fear. And she was a believer, but just the fear of being alone. Like, as soon as I left the room to go to the bathroom, like, it was, I could hear her like struggling, and just the physical, emotional, psychological suffering that humans endure is hard
Mm-hmm.
to face, and it's hard to be in the presence of that.
Yeah.
And I think it is easy, and as compassionate people, to say, well, an end to this would be a good thing, and if God determines it to be so, it is a good thing. When she passed, there was a sense of thankfulness that, Christ has received her into his family and she's no longer suffering. However, to actively end that life, I think, how do you respond to those who are suffering? Like, what would you say to them as comfort in when they're facing just that intense level of suffering?
Yeah. Yeah, I think first, not stepping out of my lane, but I know that by God's common grace, we have medication that limits the amount of pain that a patient is facing and dealing with. Also, in our anatomy, the brain function starts to wind down, and that what the stimulation a patient is feeling and the amount of pain maybe somebody thinks they're in is extremely reduced. They get a lot more sleepy. that the body is responding even slower or differently to medications, and that I would just encourage people to trust doctors, and that is a providential gift, that we have medication that is not numbing anybody in a way. I've been blessed to walk into a room with a patient who the daughter thought she was completely comatose, and had not been responsive for a couple of days. I had great rapport with that patient and stepped in the room and just said her name, and she turned, looked at me and said, "Craig, I hear Jesus calling me right now."
Mm-hmm.
And that the common grace gifts of medication are a good thing. That is
Mm-hmm.
much different than an overdose or something that is lethal. And that I think that it is not, it's not unethical for us to have somebody who's maybe in some degree of discomfort, and that for us in the dying process, we need to see it similarly to labor, to birthing a
Mm-hmm.
child. That you could have a cesarean, but why do moms want to have that baby naturally? And that we get to say in the Christian mind, that we are approaching the Lord, that we are seeing the end of life, and it can be painful, but not outside of our limitations, and that we can trust in Him, lean in Him. I would think of Jesus at the cross rejecting the sour wine, saying, "Nope, I'm going to do this thing," and that we are bearing that cross, that cruciform, even in our deathbed, and that is a difficult thing, but it is a sanctifying thing, because it's graduation day, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We're getting ready. And so the other part that I would just say is, I think an area in our culture where that would shift is, there's a reason that cemeteries used to be next door to churches, and that death has been removed from our culture, so that it is a quick live fast, live hard, and we don't see the consequence of death, and we don't see the
Mm-hmm.
process of dying, and that lives are changed when it's front and center in that exhalation, that last breath of somebody. And it's a powerful thing, and that the fear part, it can shift, it changes as you're there in the room, and as you're there front and
Mm-hmm.
center. And it's just been beautiful to sing Old Rugged Cross in the room with family, and at the very end, the very last verse, grandma takes that breath out, and it's done. You couldn't have that if you've just killed somebody, if you just
Yeah.
murdered somebody. It's not going to happen that way. And so death then is something totally different, because we know for the Christian, they're not dead, they're asleep. They're
Mm-hmm.
sleeping in glory. And so
Yeah.
you're cheating. People are being cheated out of that faith walk, that last ending groaning. And you don't want to remove them from that. We just don't want to do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, I know. Yes, with my grandfather, I remember being in the hospital with him as he was passing, and like quoting some of the scripture and like some catechism things of just like, what is
Mm-hmm.
the point of our lives. And
Mm-hmm.
just and he couldn't talk at that point, but like the look on his face was, I can't even describe it. It was just
Yeah.
so just joyful and at peace, and tears in his eyes at the same time. And really,
Mm-hmm.
it's we are death is something that is occurring in our natural bodies all the time, to one extent or the other,
Mm-hmm.
with the results of sin. And so the end of life is, in essence, not necessarily something separate or different than what we experience in our everyday sufferings. And so as we face those things, like I guess, yeah, like if we are denying the suffering, then we deny the grace that God is giving us through those things, and the sanctification, as you said, and the lessons that we're learning through all of that. And there's so much beauty to be had, both for that person and for those observing it. Sometimes the pain that you're going through isn't all, I mean, it is for your sanctification, but it's also for the sanctification of others. Like, I was extremely encouraged in my faith as I walked through that journey with my grandfather. And then to be able to see the family respond to that and turn towards each other in their grief, and to see how, we talk about the memories of that person, and just to be able to, I don't know, have that meaningful time as a family to bring each other together and minister to each other in that way is just, and it's beyond compare. I think that's a beautiful
Yeah.
aspect of God's grace through that process as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it might to the world seem peculiar to say that you're having fellowship at the deathbed, but that's what you're doing, and that's not a bad thing, because the unspoken truth that we need to remind everybody is that the mortality rate is 99.999%, right? Like, we all die, yeah, and so
Yeah.
it's coming for every last one of us. And to just stick your head in the sand and say, I'm not going to think about it, or I don't want to consider how that's going to come about for me, is to ignore a duty as a believer, and to say that I have those plans, those strategic plans within our church. We intentionally sing hymns and do catechism questions for that reason. We need to be able to a cappella sing hymns to encourage one another and to prepare the way for this soul to enter into glory. And I want to hear believers singing at my side as I get ready to depart this world. And as you did with your grandfather, right? That those, maybe he's not completely responsive, but he's in there. They hear it.
Mm-hmm.
They know
Mm-hmm.
that people are not vegetables, that there is a spirit in there that needs and desires fellowship and final peace with the Lord. And it is heartbreaking when they do not have that. And at times, like I said, palpable, it is visually evident that there is not peace, and it is a heartbreaking thing. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. So highlight that a little bit more, that difference between, so for those who are not believers, talk a little bit more about what that's like being in the room with someone who's passing, who their
Yeah.
family doesn't have faith, and they don't have faith.
Yeah, I think that typically it's there's an elephant in the room that by legal standard, maybe I can't be as evangelistic at times. We have to respect their wishes. I definitely
Yeah.
do, if they allow me to pray out the gospel, and that you hope there may be something. But I'll say that usually the unfortunate common trend is silence, that it's quiet in the room, that they're staring at walls, that there is not an interlinking of individuals together to make a family union. And that's not always the case. I want to be fair, right? That there are secular families that have been healthy, strong, and happy, but that's not the status quo. That's not the atypical experience. That there is a lacking of something, and maybe to me it's evident. Usually out of the woodwork comes somebody in the family that might be a Christian or a novel or novice believer that'll say, like, I just know there needs to be something else happening here, and this is not the case. That what they're looking for, they want something. Everybody wants something. Say something. Do something. And to tell them, what are you looking for? I know we know what they want, and certainly prepositions say, like, I do know what you're seeking, to find peace or to find calm, but instead the reaction is, I don't want to look at it. I don't want to think about it. I'm going to step outside. I can't be here as they're passing. That they shy away, and that there is, I would label it, cowardice, the same as the euthanasia approach, to say, I'm going to be a coward here. I want somebody else to be an accomplice for murder, and that it's just it's a no good preposition. To cite another text, and we see this in the Bible laid out, 1 Samuel 31. Saul's shot up with arrows, and says, asks for his armor bearer, kill me, do me in. and he can't do it. He would not do it. He was terrified, and so Saul kills himself. And
Mm.
this is the hurry up, get it done. It's heartbreaking. I had a patient not too long ago that every time I would try to, even his wife asking me, would you share the gospel with him? He said, I wish I'd had a joint this big, or I wish I could snort a line the length of my arm. And just to say, if you did, you're going to sober up at some point in time,
Yeah.
and your
What does it
problems are
actually
still
do?
waiting on you. Yeah, you're still waiting on you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's the similar thing. And the answer is, I hope I just don't wake up. But it's a very, very disappointing and heartbreaking thing where it's, well, you probably potentially ran from problems for a very, very long time with no resolution whatsoever. So yeah, it's not good, Ashley. It's not
Yeah.
great in those rooms
Yeah.
typically.
Yeah, and in therapy we talk a lot about facing up to your emotions and being able to actually process them and work through them instead of dissociate from them. And there's a lot of different
Mm-hmm.
ways that we do dissociate from them. Like you said, staring out a window, just trying to divorce our minds from what is the current pain of what's going on. I mean, you can do that with drugs and alcohol, or, just focusing on work or focusing on all these other things. But eventually, like you said, it's the questions are not going away. The situation is not
Right.
changing. And you're just making, I mean, by denying it, you're making it worse as well. You're not actually facing up to those things. And in every other way in therapy, we would recognize that and we'd say, you're trying to escape your pain and you're not dealing with it and you're not processing it. And yet for
Right.
some reason it's very inconsistent that in this way this is dignity, in this way this is a
Mm-hmm.
healthy way to deal with your despair, and your suffering is simply, well, really the ultimate dissociation, the ultimate escape.
Yeah.
um, and to me it's so backwards of what we're trying to do as counselors, as what the oath of any medical professional is. But it's like a lot of
Yeah.
terms being redefined and turned on their head. And I think this sort of relativism of whatever makes people feel good can really unground us from the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're a Christian, you have to know better. You have to have this kind of universal understanding of what is true and what is good and what is right. Otherwise, you'll get swept up into just whatever seems like the most compassionate thing at the time. But is it really the most compassionate thing? Or is it the
Yeah.
right thing?
Yeah, yeah. I think
Yeah.
this is the where your conclusion of postmodern thought comes in. Is yeah, it's completely subjective. I'm going to throw a temper tantrum, or I'm not going to deal with this, and so I'll just. My truth is that this just stops. Never mind that there is a testimony from creation that there's something else that has caused this to happen, for creation to happen, and I'm just going to completely ignore it. That's not acceptable in the cowardice of our culture to just sidestep those answers, and to not for the Christian. Uh, I would just challenge for our Christian culture that if we were evangelistic, we would be challenging others to say, how do you know that you do not have that worth? How do you not know that you do not have that value? And that
Mm-hmm.
the lost culture that we're in is not, it's not being challenged loudly by loud voices, and those loud voices being family, friends, and coworkers. And this is a testimony, I think, of our culture right now today, that the cowardice of the Christian for not pushing back and not being loud in the town square to say, I demand a hearing to tell said person before she kills herself. Has she heard the individual in the Netherlands? Has she heard a gospel presentation? We don't know.
Yeah. And I think it's clear that people who choose this, well, on average, people who pursue suicide or self-harm often do not have, uh, that's a huge risk factor for suicide in general, is
Mm-hmm.
lack of social connection, lack of people who are speaking to them of their value every day. And kind of the people that fall through the cracks, and the people there's a reason why I think the most common successful suicides are older men who are single, who live alone, because they don't tend to be as connected. They, if they don't have kids, they don't have people checking in on them. It's yeah, because we need those reminders when we're in the depths of despair, where our reality seems so dark and you're not hooked up to the truth. All you can see is just this darkness, and you need people in your life to show you, to remind you of the truth, because what you're seeing from your perspective is just so divorced from reality. And so I think, yeah, that need for preaching the gospel and having social connection, love, being present in people's lives, even if they seem standoffish.
Yeah. Right.
That's our duty. And I think a common thread in what you're saying is in response to kind of these cultural things that are happening. Our hope ultimately in pushing back at kind of a cultural level is not so much necessarily, I mean, it is good to advocate for these things in their laws, obviously, absolutely, but really the source of that is the gospel, and the source of the hope that we have is, and our hope and the strength is in God's truth and in his hope. So I really appreciate, like, that's the common
Sufficient
thread.
in all things. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Because I think in other cultural battles, it's discouraging just how death seems to be winning.
Yeah.
But that's not the truth, right?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And
And even as it feels like maybe our back is against the wall, or for the secular culture, and it might be difficult, we should be able to expound upon and explain to the individual that the fall, and that buying into that lie of death not happening, that here is this satanic lie that you can kill yourself and that there's going to be no consequence whatsoever, and that product of death is the opposite of the God that we serve, which is life. And to maybe just have a very simplistic understanding is, how will you thrive if you no longer exist, and to whose benefit does that come about, and to usher in that evangelistic time of just explaining this other perspective of a redemptive story. And that just to highlight one more time that the gospel affixes value to people in such a way that it should be completely transformative to an individual. So yeah, absolutely.
I think it's important to also to be grounded in a solid understanding of our theology on a very logical level and
Mm-hmm.
scriptural level, and to
Mm-hmm.
be well versed in that as a Christian, to be able to respond well to these things. Because I think, especially as you're engaging on social media and you're being accused of being heartless, of not caring, of, you're doing harm. Like, I was reading some articles where they were saying it would be harm to this person to not allow them the dignity to die, by the way that they choose. And if you're not grounded in being able to understand the theology, all of this, then it's easy to kind of like feel that, okay, well, I don't know, maybe that is true.
Yeah.
Like, maybe
Yeah.
like it does sound kind of nice, like, oh yeah, it's their choice, and blah blah blah, who am I to say no to you? That's your choice. I mean, and especially like, that's an even more powerful argument for the euthanasia discussion than for the abortion discussion, because it is their own body, like. And
Yeah.
so it's hard to,
Yeah.
like, okay, how can you stand up against that?
Yeah, yeah, it goes back to Genesis. That, as a new believer would think, why do we have to spend so much time? Why do we kick off our time in Genesis? And it feels boring or difficult,
Mm-hmm.
but it's that fundamental understanding of creation. And in that story is the explanation is, he made the entire universe, and he made you, and he owns you. His sovereignty is a non-negotiable.
Mm-hmm.
And this distortion leads to somebody saying in rebellion, I could take my own life because it'll make me more comfortable or happy to just end my life. And it's like, that is absurd. You are no longer existing. That is the epitome of evil, that fruit of knowledge that we consumed through that sin. It's a real testimony of the fall, and that we are like lemmings jumping off the cliff, and that the intercessor writes the word. The Lord writes this word in Scripture to inform us of our value and his plan and the redemptive story. And to just say, hey, the life that flourishes, I would like that. No, thank you. Because, I want to give somebody grace, as you're trying to say, like if somebody had extremely excruciating pain through cancer or something like that, but there's things to typically harness that, to put them into a state where they are not in excruciating pain. But I would be interested to see how many individuals pushing for euthanasia are actually suffering from something extremely painful versus are they paraplegics, quadriplegics, or mentally unhealthy, which would not qualify for any of those medications that we offer. And that the hope is the gospel resolves all of those issues one way or another.
Yeah. And being grounded in the fact that we are made in the image of God in a way that's unique from other creation, that we are, it's something that's beautiful because it both elevates humanity, but not because humanism, also elevates humanity to the idolatrous level. And then we get back to the idea of suffering and choice and all that stuff, but it's something that both elevates humanity and yet humbles us at the same time. So it gives us dignity, gives us worth, and gives us value, but it also orients our lives in a way that we have to understand that we exist for more than just ourselves at the same time. I think that's something that's really beautiful about that concept.
Amen.
Awesome. Well, as we kind of wrap up this discussion, I guess just let me ask you about what, in a nutshell, is kind of the main hope that you give people on their deathbeds. What are some words that of comfort that you give in suffering? I think we've talked about that a little bit, but just kind of sum it all up and give us a response.
When I show up as the chaplain and reach to my chaplain utility belt like Batman, I'm pulling out the 23rd Psalm and the hope that we have, and that we get to say that good shepherd is seeing you through this valley right now, and that he's got a place set for you at the table, and that as you take that last breath, that he's covered your head, covered your nose and your eyes so the bugs don't get in and get you, and he's going to see you through. And that I assure them that, that Jesus promises that he's going to wipe those tears away and you're going to be in glory. And that all of that isn't just a pick-me-up that we don't believe, but that it is a promise that the apostles and that the ancient church, and all the way to us right here globally in this world, in this age today, we get to look to that shepherd and say, yeah, it's promised, it's written, I believe it. I see the fingerprints of his grace at work daily. See the hope that his people have. I see the church, even under the pressure that it's under in this day and age, still flourishing, still thriving. See the product of righteousness in others' lives and the pursuit of it happening. I've experienced the edification that comes about through believers, and that sanctification is working. And so we can say, oh yeah, this shepherd is alive and well, and he's going to see it through. And been so blessed to experience those that are getting ready to step right across into glory. And there is no fear. And I have had sweet friends who have been terrified, Christians terrified, saying, I love you, I love this life, I don't want to leave, I'm scared. And fair, I would be too. And the answer is, when we're talking about that satanic lie, is Jesus is confronted by Satan after 40 days of temptation. He says it's written, that we don't live on bread alone. It's written that the word is good. Deuteronomy 8, he's citing that we don't live just on something that's tangible. We're gonna trust in God, and he's the sustainer. And that's always been the plan. And that as they're in their deathbed, get to say this curse is finally over and you're going to experience glorification. And that it's written right there in the 23rd Psalm that he's got you and he's going to take care of you. Nothing to be afraid of. And so, I've seen that application enough times. And as a chaplain for this hospice company, I'd say I'll never be the same person ever again. And it's been a blessing that, to witness as many deaths and to interact with so many families and to work with many wonderful Christian coworkers. I am a blessed man, and that might seem morbid to the outside world, but I just tell them you'd have to be there to get it. And it would encourage people to do so.
Amen. Well, I don't think I can add anything else to that. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, so thank you, Krag, for coming on the podcast and sharing with us your experience and grounding us in, what Scripture has to say about life and suffering and death and the meaning of all that. I think that is where we need to keep our foundation, and as these winds of cultural change come upon us. So thank you for highlighting those things. Thank you for listening to the podcast, to our listeners. And if you like what you heard here, I do have an e-course called Understanding Psychology from a Christian Perspective, where I go through how to process psychology from a Christian perspective using the framework of systematic theology. So if you're interested in that, you can click the link in the description. You can listen to some samples for free to see if it's along the lines of something you're interested in. Check that out, and you'll join us again next time.